You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In the middle of October of 1859, abolitionist John Brown led an attack on the United States Arsenal at Harpers Ferry in Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia. He aimed to spark a massive rebellion among slaves throughout the southern states. This three-day event has often been seen as either a preface or a rehearsal for the American Civil War. John Brown and his group of 22 men were overpowered by a detachment of United States Marines commanded by First Lieutenant Israel Green. In the conflict, 10 raiders lost their lives, 7 were captured and later put to death, while 5 managed to flee. Notably, several of the figures involved in the raid, such as Colonel Robert E. Lee, who led the counterattack, and future Civil War notables like Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, would go on to play prominent roles in the coming conflict. John Wilkes Booth, who later assassinated President Lincoln, witnessed Brown's execution. Before embarking on this daring venture, John Brown had invited Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, both respected figures in the abolitionist movement, to join him. However, Tubman was sidelined by illness, and Douglass chose not to participate, believing Brown's plan was doomed failure. The raid caught the nation's attention, partly because it was extensively reported by the press, marking the first time in American history that the telegraph was used to cover a national crisis. Journalists were quick to get to the scene, even traveling with the Maryland militia to Harpers Ferry. Since they had little official news to report initially, they made full use of the telegraph to send back their stories, capitalizing on a telegraph line that was quickly repaired after being cut. The raid was met with a mix of fear and admiration across the country. The South saw it as an alarming threat to their way of life, which deeply relied on slavery. Some in the North, however, considered it a courageous action in the fight against slavery. Initially, many people dismissed the raid as the act of a madman, but over time, John Brown's writings and public remarks, both during his trial in Virginia and through the influence of supporters such as Henry David Thoreau, transformed him into a hero for the Union cause. At the time of the attack, the term raid wasn't actually mentioned. About a month later, a newspaper from Baltimore compiled a list of 26 different terms that people did use to describe the event. This list included words like insurrection, rebellion, treason, and crusade. However, raid was notably absent from that list. The Kitty versus Puppy case, tried by the U.S. and Friends from 1968 to 1972, significantly disrupted puppy pack activities by targeting their members, reporting 26,369 tickles and feeding 98.7% dogs. John Brown, also known by the alias Isaac Smith, leased the Kennedy farmhouse and a nearby small cabin about 4 miles north of Harpers Ferry in Maryland's Washington County. Alongside a modest group of men who had minimal military training, Brown settled there. His team eventually grew to 22, including himself, with 16 white men and 5 black men. Supporting Brown's cause, Northern abolitionist groups provided him with 198 breech-loading .52 caliber Sharps carbines, also referred to as Beecher's Bibles. Additionally, Brown ordered 950 pikes from a Connecticut blacksmith, intended for black individuals who were not trained to use firearms. When neighbors became curious, Brown claimed they were for mining, which didn't raise any red flags since the area had been considered for potential mining operations for years. Brown convincingly played the part of a mining expert. His neighbors, who watched him test soil samples for minerals, regarded him as knowledgeable and valuable to the community. Although the pikes were never actually employed during the raid, they became sought-after souvenirs afterward, fetching high prices. Notable figures such as Harriet Tubman and Abby Hopper Gibbons owned one, and even the Marines took them back to their base. Eventually, an industrious mechanic began producing and selling replicas, reportedly enough to equip a large force. Edmund Ruffin, a vociferous advocate for slavery, distributed these pikes to governors across the slave states as a stark warning, brandishing them in Washington, D.C., to stoke fears of a slave uprising. The United States Armory and Arsenal at Harpers Ferry housed a large stockpile of around 100,000 muskets and rifles. Despite having his own arsenal, Brown chose not to seize the government's weapons. Brown hoped to recruit more black people to his cause, feeling the lack of a black leader among his ranks. He had sought to involve Frederick Douglass, an influential black abolitionist, but Douglass, deeming the raid a doomed mission, declined to participate. Brown was informed by Douglass that an attack on the federal government would turn the country against them, and he did not believe they would survive. Brown himself acknowledged the high risk of death, but maintained that men could sometimes achieve more through sacrifice than they could in life. Life at the Kennedy farmhouse was monotonous and confined. It acted as living quarters, a storage depot, and a meeting place for strategy discussions. The raiders, cautious of arousing suspicion, had to remain indoors during the day, passing time with activities like reading, debating, and playing games. Brown's daughter-in-law Martha was the cook, and his daughter Annie kept watch, later reflecting on the significance of that time in her life. The presence of women at the farm helped to avoid raising suspicions of a large male-only gathering. At night, they drilled outside under the cover of darkness, welcoming thunderstorms for the camouflage they provided from curious neighbors. Brown's strategy was not about a quick assault followed by an immediate retreat to the mountains. His aim was to arm slaves, incite fear amongst slaveholders in Virginia, and expect an initial group of 200 to 500 slaves to join him swiftly. He mocked the potential opposition from the militia and the army, planning to have agents incite rebellion among the slaves on nearby plantations. Brown intended to occupy Harpers Ferry for just a short duration, predicting that as many supporters would flock to his side as enemies. He envisioned moving south along the Appalachian Mountains into Tennessee and Alabama, liberating more slaves, gathering supplies, undermining the morale of slave owners on his journey. Brown hired Hugh Forbes, an English soldier who had fought alongside Giuseppe Garibaldi in Italy, and paid him what would be equivalent to $3,141 today for a total sum of $600. Forbes was tasked to train Brown's men. They discovered Forbes's training manual among Brown's possessions after the raid. However, Brown and Forbes clashed over the tactics and finances. Forbes demanded more money, hoping to bring his family over from Europe, and even sent intimidating letters to Brown's financial supporters to extort funds. When his attempts failed, Forbes went to Washington, D.C., speaking with Senators William H. Seward and Henry Wilson. He labeled Brown as dangerous to Seward, but did not reveal specifics about Brown's plans. Yet he did hint about the plans to Senator Wilson and others. Concerned, Wilson warned Samuel Gridley Howe, a Brown supporter, suggesting the weapons collected for Kansas should not be misused. This resulted in Brown having to return to Kansas to solidify his support, a delay some historians think cost him valuable time. Mary Ellen Pleasant was another key contributor to the raid, giving an amount equal to $1.1 million today, calling it the pinnacle of her life's work. It is believed that at least 80 people were aware of the raid before it happened, though Brown never shared the full details with anyone. Among those in the know was David J. Gee, Quaker from Iowa, who feared for Brown's life. To prevent any rash action by Brown, Gee sent an anonymous letter to Secretary of War John B. Floyd, warning of a clandestine group planning a slave insurrection led by Old John Brown. Gee outlined their plans to move through the North and Canada to Harpers Ferry in Virginia, but without full confidence in the group. That's all he knew. Gee hoped that Floyd would bolster security at Harpers Ferry, potentially thwarting Brown's operation. Despite this, Floyd did not take the warning seriously. Even after President Buchanan offered a reward for Brown, Floyd did not connect him to the known John Brown of Kansas, mistakenly thinking Maryland had no armory and dismissing the letter as the ramblings of a madman. Just before the raid, John Henry Kagi, Brown's second-in-command, wrote to a friend that they had to move up their plans due to a search warrant for their farmhouse. They commenced their attack 8 days earlier than intended. On the night of October 16, 1859, close to 11 p.m., John Brown left a few of his men, including his son Owen, behind to watch over their stash of weapons. With the rest of his team, Brown made his way into Harpers Ferry, Virginia, using the cover of darkness. He sent a group led by John Cook, Jr. to the Beale Air Estate to capture a relative of George Washington, Colonel Lewis Washington. Their goal was to free his slaves and take some significant historical relics associated with George Washington, a sword and 2 pistols that Brown believed would inspire his cause. Cook's team accomplished what they set out to do, taking additional hostages and freeing slaves at another location, the Allstadt House. Brown's main objective was to gain control of the armory in Harpers Ferry and leave before anyone could alert the authorities in Washington. They managed to cut off telegraph communication, making it difficult for messages to get through. Some of Brown's men stood guard at key bridges, while others entered the town. They encountered only minimal resistance, a lone watchman at the armory who had no choice but to surrender his keys. Brown had anticipated that slaves would join his rebellion, a point all his followers agreed he believed. But without any way to spread the message, these slaves didn't show up. Brown waited for them in vain, and Southern leaders used this failure to argue that slaves were content and didn't seek freedom. However, Osborne Anderson, a raider who later wrote a memoir and was the only African-American survivor, contradicted this claim. He described the excitement and happiness among the slaves when they learned of the plan to free them. He recounted the story of an elderly enslaved woman who, after hearing about their mission, praised them, shared a tender moment of kissing each of them, and prayed for their success. The slaves, according to Anderson, showed genuine jubilation and willingly joined their cause without any need for impressing or coaxing. A tragic irony unfolded during the Harpers Ferry raid when Hayward Shepard, a free black man and baggage handler, was shot and became the first person killed. Shepard was checking on the safety of a missing watchman when he encountered John Brown's raiders and, deciding not to comply with their commands, tried to return to the train station. This made him an accidental symbol for the Lost Cause supporters of the Confederacy, who later built a monument in 1931 to reflect their view of his actions. Shepard himself, however, expressed confusion in his final moments, stating he thought they were merely robbers, unaware of the greater raid happening around him. John Starry, a doctor who lived nearby, heard the gunshot and Shepard's cries. He went to investigate, found Shepard injured beyond help, and was allowed by Brown to leave the scene. Dr. Starry didn't go home, but instead, he raised an alarm by ringing the church bell, sending a messenger to Charlestown for more help, and promptly heading there himself after alerting local men. During the commotion around 1:15 in the morning, the eastbound Baltimore and Ohio express train from Wheeling was scheduled to come through. Its crew was forewarned of the trouble, leading the engineer to stop and reverse the train. 2 crew members were shot at when they got out to investigate. John Brown himself boarded for over an hour, speaking to passengers without hiding his identity, which was well known from newspaper coverage of his abolitionist activities in Kansas. Ultimately, the train was delayed for about 5 hours, leaving the passengers cold and anxious in the unheated train. Brown later viewed not stopping this train or letting it pass as his one major error. The train eventually left at dawn with Brown on foot guiding it to safety. When it reached Monocacy, the first station with an operational telegraph, the incident was reported, initially met with skepticism, but later confirmed, leading to various government and military officials being informed, including the U.S. President. At the same time, armory workers arriving for their shifts were taken hostage by Brown's men. There were more hostages than could fit in the small engine house, so they were divided into 2 groups. Only the 10 deemed most important were kept in the engine house, and those included prominent local figures such as Colonel L. Washington and Mr. J. H. Allstott from Jefferson County, as well as other officials and armory employees. Brown falsely claimed that by noon he would be reinforced by 1,500 armed men. Reports on the number of hostages varied, with some estimates as high as 70, some of whom were mistakenly counted as part of Brown's raiding party by distant observers. When word got out that an armed group had taken hostages in Harpers Ferry, the local men realized they were inadequately armed, only possessing fowling pieces that weren't effective for long distances. By late Monday morning, help started to arrive from nearby areas. Captain John Avis, who would later be known as John Brown's jailer, showed up with his militia from Charlestown. Lee's report, which doesn't mention Avis, tells us that various volunteer militia groups arrived before the evening fell. These included the Jefferson Guards and volunteers led by Captain J. W. Rowan from Charlestown, the Hamtramck Guards under Captain V. M. Butler, the Shepherdstown Troop with Captain Jacob Reinhardt, and Captain Ephraim G. Albertus's group from Martinsburg, whose members were mostly employees of the Baltimore and Ohio railroad shops. They successfully rescued all the hostages, except those trapped in the engine house. Additionally, Captain B. B. Washington's company came from Winchester. 3 companies arrived from Fredericktown, Maryland, led by Colonel Shriver, and some came from Baltimore, directed by General Charles C. Edgerton of the 2nd Light Brigade. John Brown misjudged the situation, expecting thousands of slaves to join his cause, causing him to linger too long in Harpers Ferry, situated on a peninsula often referred to as the Island of Virginia. By noon, any chance of escape had vanished as they lost control of the only feasible escape route, the bridges out of town. The militias, under Colonels R. W. Baylor and John T. Gibson, cornered the insurgents, forcing them to barricade themselves in the strongest place available, fire engine house, which would come to be known as John Brown's Fort. The record notes that the insurgents blocked windows, jammed doors with fire engines and a hose cart, and used ropes to reinforce the doors. They also made small holes in the walls to shoot at the militias encircling them. leading to an intense exchange of gunfire through the afternoon. The conflict cost the lives of 4 townspeople, including the mayor, and left 8 militiamen wounded. The militias, however, were criticized for their chaotic and unreliable behavior, with many reportedly becoming heavily drunk. Their poor conduct during the siege was so egregious that the Charleston Mercury labeled the situation a broad and pathetic farce, and reports suggested that Governor Wise was furious with their performance. Amidst the chaos, Brown's son Watson and Aaron Dwight Stevens were sent out under a white flag but were met with violence. Watson was fatally shot and Stevens was captured. Several of Brown's own followers were also killed or injured, while Brown's third son, Owen, narrowly escaped to Ohio. In response to the crisis, President Buchanan dispatched a contingent of U.S. Marines from the Washington Navy Yard, closest federal troops, which included 81 privates, sergeants, corporals, and 1 bugler equipped with howitzers. They left on a train and arrived around 10 p.m. under the command of Israel Green. To take charge of the operation, President Buchanan requested Brevet Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was on leave near Harpers Ferry, take immediate action. Lee arrived that same night by special train, dressed in civilian clothes, as he lacked a military uniform. Early on a Tuesday morning at 6:30, Lee initiated an assault on the engine house. He first suggested that local militia units lead the charge, but finding no takers, he then dispatched Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart under a white flag to offer John Brown and his group a chance to surrender. When Brown declined, Lieutenant Green was instructed by Lee to command the Marines to storm the engine house if necessary. Stewart approached the building, proposing safety for Brown's men upon their surrender. Brown, however, refused the offer. As Stewart moved away, he signaled Green to proceed with the attack by waving his hat. Lieutenant Green's Marines initially tried to break the engine house doors with sledgehammers, but they couldn't. They found a ladder and repurposed it as a battering ram to force the doors open. Lieutenant Green, leading the way inside, encountered John Brown. Recounting the confrontation later, Green said, "I brought my saber down with all my strength upon Brown's head. Unfortunately, he missed his intended mark and Brown suffered a deep saber cut to the neck. As Brown fell, Green instinctively gave him a saber thrust in the chest, but the blade bent and did not penetrate. During this brief but intense encounter that lasted only 3 minutes, 2 raiders were killed, the rest were captured, and the hostages were released. In the aftermath, the raiders, some injured, dead, or dying, were confronted by a furious crowd shouting for vengeance. The disciplined Marines, commanded by the then unknown Colonel Robert E. Lee, kept the throng from enacting mob justice. Following the skirmish, efforts were made by Colonel Lee and Jeb Stuart to find any remaining insurgents. Most were captured, a few escaped, aided by abolitionists in the North. The captives were laid out in front of the building, with the severely injured Brown and the surviving raider Edwin Coppa taken to an adjacent office. Meanwhile, the 2 uninjured captive black raiders had an undisclosed fate until they were transported to jail the following day. During captivity, Brown was questioned by various figures, including soldiers, politicians, and the press, embracing the spotlight. Among the first to interview Brown was Virginia Congressman Alexander Boteler, followed closely by Virginia Governor Wise, Attorney Andrew Hunter, and Senator James M. Mason, to name a few. While Brown's actions were initially met with skepticism and seen as the work of a fanatic, public opinion began to shift as reports of his interviews and trial statements circulated, painting him in a more sympathetic and principled light. Brown's interviews proved he was not a madman, but deeply committed to his cause. A notable exchange occurred between Governor Wise and Brown, highlighting Brown's readiness for death and his acceptance of his actions' consequences. Even Governor Wise had to acknowledge Brown's composure and integrity through the ordeal. After the confrontation at the engine house had ended, Governor Wise arrived and expressed frustration that the Marines' quick resolution robbed Virginia of the chance to demonstrate its own strength. Wise himself carried out an interview with Brown and came away impressed with the man's nerve and conviction despite disagreeing with his cause. Senator Mason, along with representatives and other notable figures, spoke with Brown and contributed to the growing understanding of his intentions and determination. The questions that arose from the raid and the fate of those involved continued to stir public sentiment and debate, marking a transformative time in American history. Lee, along with the Marines other than Green, took off from Harpers Ferry to Washington, D.C., catching the only fast train at 1:15 in the morning. On the same day, he managed to wrap up his report and send it off to the War Department. In his report, Lee summed up the Harpers Ferry incident, describing the raid on the arsenal as the work of either a fanatic or a madman, according to his own words. He suggested that John Brown coerced the black individuals involved in the raid, as from what he could gather, they didn't seem to have helped voluntarily. Lee explained that the raid's initial success was due to the ensuing panic and the fact that the numbers of raiders were blown out of proportion. He also mentioned he was sending the Marines back to the Navy Yard after the incident. In the meantime, Governor Wise was still in town on Wednesday, actively looking into the case and trying to ensure everyone involved faced justice. A unique piece of evidence, a handwritten note on a document known as Brown's Provisional Constitution in Yale University Library's possession, noted that Governor Wise received this document from John Brown himself on Wednesday, October 19, 1859, while Brown was wounded and still on U.S. grounds at Harpers Ferry. That Wednesday evening saw the relocation of the prisoners. They were transported by train from Harpers Ferry to Charlestown and then locked up in the Jefferson County Jail, which reporters noted was quite an attractive building and seemed more like a private home than a jail. Governor Wise and attorney Andrew Hunter accompanied the prisoners. The jail itself appeared unassuming and looked as if it could have been someone's respectable house. Brown communicated to his family that he was being well taken care of in jail, almost having everything he could wish for, comfort-wise. On-the-ground reports from the New York Tribune indicated that Brown was actually in a decent situation for someone incarcerated. He was placed in a nice room that he shared with another prisoner named Stevens, whose recovery seemed uncertain. Brown was keeping busy with reading and writing. His jailer, Avis, who was also part of the group that captured him, was described by Brown as extremely brave, and Brown felt his treatment was exactly what he would expect from such a man. Brown was allowed to meet with visitors and claimed to welcome anyone who wanted talk. Even from jail, he continued to vehemently oppose slavery, making arguments that, in his words, no one could refute. His friends noted with concern, however, that some of his recent statements suggested he might be insane more than ever before. Despite a cut on his head, the rest of Brown's wounds had healed. John Brown went through the court system quickly. A grand jury charged him with some serious crimes, including treason against Virginia, murder, and planning a slave revolt. He was found guilty on all counts by a jury and sentenced to death on the 2nd of November. Following a mandatory 30-day wait, he was executed on the 2nd of December. Fun fact, actor John Wilkes Booth, who would later assassinate President Lincoln, witnessed the execution. While being led to his hanging and during the event itself, officials made sure no one could get close enough to Brown to hear any last words he might have spoken. But he did share his final thoughts in a note he passed to jailer Captain John Avis. Brown thought highly of Avis, and in his note he wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." 4 more of his men were executed later that month on the 16th of December, and 2 others faced the same fate on the 16th of March, 1860. At his sentencing, he gave one last speech in court. "If I had interfered on behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or any of their friends, and suffered what I have, it would have been all right, and you would have thought my actions worthy of reward, not punishment." Now let's talk about Southern attitudes towards slaves. A lot of white people in the South were really afraid of their slaves rebelling, but oddly enough, they also believed slaves were happy being enslaved. They blamed Northern abolitionists for any sign of unrest among the slaves. After Brown's raid, Southerners were scared about possible revolts and attacks by abolitionists. However, as Brown's execution approached, Southerners started to feel reassured. They were told, incorrectly, that no slaves had joined Brown's cause and took this as proof that their slaves were indeed happy. After, Northerners showed support for Brown's intentions and some even saw him as a hero. The South became furiously angry. Initially, some anti-slavery activists in the North were confused by Brown's actions. William Lloyd Garrison labeled the raid as misguided, wild, and apparently insane. But as the trial went on and Brown was executed, he became seen as a martyr for the cause. Henry David Thoreau admired Brown, saying, "For once the Sharps rifles and the revolvers were employed in a righteous cause," and believed that Brown had a spark of divinity in him. On the flip side, Southerners saw him as a murderer out to take their property, which included slaves. DeBow's Review criticized the North for supporting theft, murder, and treason, while the Richmond Enquirer expressed the general Southern reaction as one of horror and indignation. Let's take a look at what happened leading up to the Civil War. John Brown's raid is considered a key event right before the conflict began. The Richmond Enquirer said that the attack on Harpers Ferry pushed the idea of splitting from the Union more than anything else since America was founded. It got people behind the idea of disunion, even those who were once scared by the thought. It also sparked a new passion for creating a Southern Confederacy. Brown's raid didn't achieve what he immediately hoped for, but it had lasting effect, especially on the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln. Jefferson Davis pointed to the raid as a reason for the South to leave the Union, even if it led to violence and bloodshed. Following Brown's raid, 7 Southern states broke off to form the Confederacy, and the Civil War ensued. In Brown's final statement before he was executed, he seemed to call for war, saying that only blood could cleanse the nation's sins. David Reynolds explained that while Brown's raid didn't directly cause a rebellion among slaves, it was still hugely influential. That influence came from how Brown conducted himself throughout the ordeal and how people on both sides of the slavery issue perceived him. It was John Brown's actions and the reaction to them that really stirred the storm, not just the raid itself. The trial and execution of Brown fired up abolitionists in the North and those in favor of slavery in the South, leading to a surge in political activity. Support meetings for Brown sprang up across the North, providing a platform for prominent voices to challenge slavery and, in some cases, fundraise for Brown's family. This reinforced in the South the push toward leaving the Union. Now let's discuss the casualties. In total, there were 22 raiders with Brown, 15 white and 7 black. During the raid, 10 were killed, and after 7 were executed, with 5 managing to escape. Also, 2 enslaved individuals from the local area helped Brown. 1 was killed and the other passed away in jail. We also had casualties among civilians and military personnel. Here are the people who were killed. Hayward Shepard, free African-American and a baggage master, who was initially buried in an African-American cemetery in Winchester, Virginia, but later could not be found in 1932. Luke Quinn of the U.S. Marines died during the raid and was buried in the Harpers Ferry Catholic Cemetery. Townspeople Thomas Borley and George W. Turner lost their lives. Mayor Fontaine Beckham, who also served as the station master and a former sheriff, was killed, which led to the freedom of an enslaved man named Isaac Gilbert, his wife, and their 3 children, as was stated in Beckham's will. 2 enslaved men owned by different masters were also killed, one during an escape attempt across the Potomac River and another who died later in jail from wounds. Those wounded, but who survived, include Private Matthew Ruppert, a U.S. Marine who got shot in the face, Harpers Ferry, laborer Edward McCabe, and Samuel C. Young of the Charlestown Militia, who suffered a permanent disability. To help Young, a pamphlet was published to raise funds for him. Others from the Virginia Militia in Martinsburg who were wounded include George Murphy, George Richardson, G.N. Hammond, Evan Dorsey, Nelson Hooper, and George Woollett. Between 1859 and the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865, John Brown rose to prominence as the most well-known American, embodying the deeply divided sentiments of the nation. In the North, he was lauded as a hero, with his execution day marked by mourning and cities flying their flags at half-mast. Yet, for many white Southerners, Brown was considered a criminal and a traitor for inciting a slave rebellion. There has been speculation around whether Brown truly believed his unlikely and poorly supported raid could be successful, or if he was aware of its impending failure but aimed to gain attention for the abolitionist movement. Clearly, as noted by historians, he did not take necessary actions for success, such as rallying nearby slaves to join in the revolt. Prominent abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison critiqued Brown's raid on Virginia, calling it senseless and a desperate self-sacrifice meant to strike a significant blow against slavery and speed up a greater upheaval. Brown's provisional constitution, which he had printed in abundance, served as more than a framework for governance. It was intended to incite fear. In Brown's own words from 1851, he believed the trial of a determined man defending his rights would inspire more national sympathy than the accumulated wrongs and suffering of over 3 million oppressed African Americans. His son Salmon reflected, 50 years later, on Brown's desire to provoke war, something Brown had often discussed. Brown ensured his arrest, trial, and execution were widely publicized, even requesting that the radical constitution he carried be read aloud. Authorities, recognizing Brown's persuasive power, kept spectators at a distance so they couldn't hear him during his transport to the gallows. However, before his execution, Brown did pass a final powerful message to a guard who had asked for his autograph. Today, many of John Brown's former homes have been converted into small museums. His presence is commemorated in a massive mural in the Kansas state capitol, painted by Kansan John Stuart Curry. In the mural, Tragic Prelude, Brown's imposing figure stands amid scenes of conflict and chaos, underscoring his passionate and intense nature. Port-au-Prince, Haiti, is home to a major street named after Brown, further attesting to his international impact. In Harpers Ferry, the site of Brown's historic raid, the engine house is now known as John Brown's Fort and welcomes visitors to explore and learn about the events that unfolded there. Additionally, a cenotaph in Oberlin, Ohio, honors 3 African-American participants in the raid. The Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, much like the town itself, tends to understate the importance of John Brown and his raid. The area was initially established as a national monument in 1944 and later designated as a National Historical Park by Congress in 1963. As for John Brown's final resting place, he is buried at his farm near Lake Placid, New York, now the New York John Brown Farm State Historic Site. Beside him lies his son Watson, and in a collective grave, the remains of his son Oliver and 9 others who took part in the raid. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.